There are so many build options in Path of Exile that many players have trouble deciding what they want to play. And this also seems to be the case when Redditors want to discuss whether they should league start with Toxic Rain or Explosive Arrow. I'm currently on the lookout for a comfy league starter that can scale to do all content. I'm eyeballing TR Ballista and EA Ballista. What do you recommend? Is one clearly better? More comfortable maybe? Let me know please. So this was an interesting post that I came across because unlike most responses where players overwhelmingly favor one build over another, this particular post actually had players split evenly between whether Toxic Rain or Explosive Arrow was better. I played both and Explosive Arrow is way superior. I played both and Toxic Rain is way superior. So clearly it seems that between these two popular league starter choices, players are rather adamant about which build is better. One could argue that either of these respective builds has better scaling than the other, but the main similarity for these two builds lie in the fact that they both deal damage over time. And the primary caveat to playing either Toxic Rain or Explosive Arrow with a totem build is the extreme delayed damage profile. But how do players actually feel about each of these respective league starters? Toxic Rain was a pain to play with, especially with totems. You wait for the totem placement, arrows to fly down, pods to open, and dot to kick in. At the same time, mobs were already gone. It was way too awkward. And so just like I mentioned, playing Toxic Rain Ballistas has an extremely delayed damage profile, even though the damage scaling on this build is incredibly strong and would allow players to clear all content on a singular build. Dealing with the awkwardness of how this damage is delivered early on may turn off quite a few players. But does this downside necessarily make Toxic Rain Ballistas worse than Explosive Arrow? Isn't EA basically the same? You wait for the totem placement, arrows to stick, then explode, and dot to kick in. And this was a very reasonable observation made by another user because just like Toxic Rain, Explosive Arrow also has a pretty significant time delay before damage could be dealt as well. Yeah, but the ignite, even if it takes seconds to go off, sticks on the mob rather than the ground. And what's even better is that it proliferates to other mobs around as well. Explosive Arrow coverage is way better than Toxic Rain in my opinion, at least if we're talking about ballista builds. And this player is absolutely correct. I personally have played both of these builds as league starters in the past, and while dealing chaos damage is generally stronger since it can bypass any energy shield based defenses, Explosive Arrow does in fact have better coverage. This is due to the ignite proliferation mechanic incorporated into this build, and unless the player who chose Toxic Rain plans to pivot his build into using Caustic Arrow to clear maps, Explosive Arrow will always perform better than Toxic Rain in terms of clear speed. Ran it as my league starter, and the worst part of it was having to run backwards all the time to get the mobs chasing me back to the pod so they die. With Explosive Arrow, they're firing at the mobs and the arrows stick to the mob and not the ground, so there's less backtracking overall. Now this player brings up a very important difference between how Explosive Arrow and Toxic Rain interact with enemy mobs. Although Toxic Rain may have less time delay than Explosive Arrow before damage is delivered, it does come with the drawback that its damage is reliant on enemies being close to where the arrow initially landed. Since Explosive Arrow can actually stick to the enemies that it fires at, the damage dealt is only dependent on if the arrow landed on the enemy rather than if they stayed near where it landed. On top of that, Explosive Arrow also travels in a straight line, which contributes to its better clear speed as well. But are there any players who feel that Toxic Rain is better than Explosive Arrow? Toxic Rain is better on Pathfinder because of the auto wither. I played it in the Sentinel event and it was great. Easy ride through the axe up to red maps, minimal gear needed, flasks solve your defenses, and a bulk of suppression is on the tree. So according to this player, Toxic Rain is actually better than Explosive Arrow because of the Nature's Reprisal Ascendancy. This passive basically allows Pathfinders to inflict wither, which greatly scales the chaos damage taken by enemy monsters. On top of that, because Pathfinders can scale flask effect and duration really well, they can rely on their flask to take care of their defenses. But not everyone seems to think that Ballista Totems is the best way to go. Toxic Rain is perfectly fine for regular gameplay, and it easily transitions into Caustic Arrow, which is one of the fastest mappers in the game that doesn't require high investment. Toxic Rain is bait though. Now what's interesting about this opinion is that I've personally tested this out and find Toxic Rain Ballistas to be fine for just single target damage. However, when it comes to clearing maps, I would prefer to switch to a second 6 link with Caustic Arrow instead. Using Toxic Rain Ballistas as the primary ability will lead to the clunky gameplay that many players find unpleasant with this build archetype. I have no idea why people keep complaining about Toxic Rain's clear speed. You never map with TR anyways. You use Caustic Arrow on the second 6 link. Now I personally haven't spent much time testing out Toxic Rain Ballistas as the main ability of a build, but I can assure you that most players would prefer the clear speed of Caustic Arrow, or or at the very least choose to self-cast their Toxic Rain. The problem is that attack speed does not scale Caustic Arrow damage and it's mandatory for Toxic Rain. I prefer CA with Death's Oath and normal TR paired with TR'd Ballistae. So these are some options that are far more synergistic for League starters than running just Toxic Rain totems alone. But even with all these options available, there are still many players who disagree whether Toxic Rain or Explosive Arrow is the better choice. EA Ballista hits harder, scales harder, and is easier to scale. It's also cheaper. Having played both builds recently, I'd say EA over TR. Easily took EA to Ubers, whereas with TR, I felt like I was struggling with damage. Both are tanky in their own right. So according to these players, Explosive Arrow actually does scale damage better than Toxic Rain, even given the fact that it also has to deal with energy shield based defenses that Toxic Rain could otherwise ignore. EA has more damage and better clear. TR is more comfy, has more sustained quality of life, and runs faster. In my opinion, TR is better overall because it can get enough damage for pretty much anything, and the survival with Permaflask is so good. Now I'm assuming that this player is comparing EA Ballistas to a pure Toxic Rain build, because if a player were to equip a Pathfinder with a Caustic Arrow Nova setup, there is no way that EA has better clear, especially since it also has lower movement speed. An interesting caveat I found while playing with EA Ballistas though, is that if you try to scale your movement speed too high, you will end up needing to backtrack to pick up loot due to its delayed damage. In my opinion, TR is generally faster than EA in terms of raw movement speed and mobility, but it has a big flaw against moving targets where they can just walk out of your damage zone. It's fine for general mapping, but for certain content like Cyrus or Maven where they keep moving constantly, it can sort of feel bad, especially since it has a bit of ramp up time. EA is an all-purpose all-rounder, a bit finicky to get going since you don't have access to it as early as TR and have to basically hard swap to it when you do. Accuracy is a concern, attack speed breakpoints are a concern, duration is a concern, getting no fire damage on gear is a concern, but once you get through the checklist, it cruises through to the end game very easily. Now this is actually a fair summary of what the trade-offs for playing each of these builds actually are. On one hand, Caustic Arrow and Toxic Rain on Pathfinder do actually make for a far superior mapping experience, but put it against some of the deeper endgame content and it will start to struggle. On the other hand, Explosive Arrow does make for a more well-rounded build, but at the cost of mapping clear speed and numerous gearing breakpoints. But within the context of Explosive Arrow builds, what class do players think is the better choice for EA Ballistas? No comparison, EA Elementalist is better. And feel like a wet toilet paper? No thanks. I'd rather deal 40% less damage but have an extremely forgiving and comfy playstyle with EA Champion. EA Elementalist doesn't feel like wet toilet paper. It's less tanky than Champ, but if you don't go for full damage or ignore defenses, then it's tanky enough for softcore. So even though it's already been established that Explosive Arrow is a strong, well-rounded skill, there are still many differences to consider when choosing between Elementalist or EA Champion. Now with playing Champion, the one downside I know of early on is dealing with poor access to Ignite chance. Because Champions cannot guarantee an Ignite in the same way that Elementalists do, they have to travel pretty far along the passive tree in order to achieve a 100% chance to Ignite. But on the flip side, since Elementalists cannot guarantee a hit with their arrows in the same way that Champions can, they have to ensure that they stack enough accuracy rating on their gear in order to achieve a 100% chance to hit. Taunting totems is so much quality of life, I could never play any other class with totems. EA Champ is a monster. In this league, I managed to get my build to almost 20 million DPS and could tank an Uber Shaper Slam. It was nutty. I don't know why anyone would want to play Elementalist. The damage boost is really not worth having basically no defensive layers. I don't know how poorly you're building your EA, but with 100% suppress, Primal Aegis feels just as good as Champ for mapping if you don't stop moving. So it seems that the general assumptions here is that Champion is the tankier of the two options, whereas playing Elementalist is the higher damage choice. Now it's actually been quite a while since I've played EA Elementalist, so it might be hard for me to speak on this, but from what I remember, Primal Aegis never really provided much in terms of damage reduction, especially because it was just flat damage absorption instead of a scaling defensive layer. Obviously, if we add 100% chance to suppress on top of that, it might be a different story, but getting this much suppression is a lot harder on Elementalist than it is for Champion. Overall, I think that Toxic Rain and Caustic Arrow Pathfinder will always provide a smoother mapping experience, while Explosive Arrow builds will give players a more well-rounded experience between boss fighting and mapping. And when choosing between Elementalist or Champion for Explosive Arrow builds, Elementalist will scale far better in terms of damage but will require more attention to stay alive while playing, whereas Champion gives far more leeway for players to focus less less of their attention on the game if they happen to be watching something else on a second monitor.